Welcome everybody to today's Eco Talk on this wonderful warm Friday afternoon. It's my pleasure to introduce Tim Bartley, who is a sociologist here in the Earth Commons and does fascinating work on supply chains. So he studies the environment, environmental justice, and regulation of global industries. More broadly, he does work on sort of political, organizational, and economic processes that shape our environment, workplace, and landscape more broadly. And his 2018 book, which I just learned, I didn't know that you won awards for your book, although it was a very fancy book and it deserves them, Rules Without Rights, Land, Labor, and Private Authority in the Global Economy, which was the winner of the Harold and Margaret Sprout Award. Is that right? Sprout? Truly Sprout? All right, from the Environmental Studies and International Studies Association. So it's a very appropriate name for that kind of award. And so without further ado, I will hand it over to Tim for his talk today. Thank you so much, Tim, for joining us, and thank you.
Thank you. Thanks, everyone. I don't have pictures of myself running around the Amazon or satellite imagery or birds or sea captains. I have some stories of some people that I talked to, a little bit of data, and I think a timely set of questions about climate policies in a world of global supply chains, and currently, I think, in a world of moment of backlash to climate policy, not just in the US, but in the EU, which of course has been a more hopeful, more serious place for climate policy. Some of this work is done with collaborators and with help from people here and in other places as well. And I will start by kind of reflecting a little bit on global supply chains. When I was just beginning my dissertation 20-something years ago, and I was studying global supply chains, it was not really a household term. There were, of course, bodies of research, some in sociology, on things like global commodity chains, global value chains, global production networks, all of which kind of refer to the same process of production being extended across organizational boundaries and national boundaries as well. But it was a little bit hard to talk to people about global supply chains. And then in 2020, in the midst of the COVID-19 pandemic, supply chains became very much on people's minds as they faltered and were disrupted. You might remember some scenes like this. More recently, with the horrific bombings in Iran and the disruptions that have followed, once again, I think, alerted to the fragility of supply chains and the disruptions that can ripple broadly. Actually, the article on the right here is from New York Times just today, discussing not just oil, but other kinds of supply chains that are being disrupted. And of course, these disruptions are hard to deal with in the US, but even harder to deal with in other parts of the world, where fuel price increases, for instance, can have devastating effects. When events like these aren't happening, to a large extent, supply chains are kind of invisible to us. That is, when they work sort of as designed, we often don't think much about global supply chains that produce our stuff. We have sort of, I think, some general consciousness that there are people and places and processes stretching around the world, producing the clothes, electronics, and food that we consume every day. And maybe we think about those issues through the lens of conscientious consumption, how we can be responsible consumers, but we often don't think about them as policy problems and regulatory problems. When we think about environmental regulations, we think about often land and water and air that's closer to us. And when we think about climate and climate policy, we typically think about energy production within the US and ways in which it could be transformed to be lower carbon. I think that's unfortunate because many of the environmental consequences and the climate consequences of the US economy, of course, are happening elsewhere through emissions in global supply chains, or so-called Scope 3 emissions. It depends a lot on the industry, but in some industries, Scope 3 emissions can be 10 to 90 times as high as scope 1 or scope 2 emissions. That is, emissions in the global value chain can be much higher than directed emissions from production at the site of production, or even energy-based emissions in that site. In materials industries, recent estimates suggest scope 3 emissions are about 10 times as high as scope 1 and 2 emissions for US firms. And in retailing, as you might imagine, scope 3 emissions are something like 90 times as high as scope 1 and scope 2 emissions. So one thing I've been studying in my previous work is how people conceptualize these kinds of sort of distant environmental harms. Specifically, I've been looking at how people respond to information about different kinds of problems in global value chains. And I want to start by showing you just a couple of pieces of evidence from survey experiments that I've done over the past few years before telling you this story about climate policy in the EU. So one of the things that we did a few years back was to do a survey experiment in the US where we showed people different scenarios with different types of problems that might be encountered in the production of things like clothing, electronics, or seafood in locations around the world. And this is a survey experiment in which we could randomize the information that people saw, including the kinds of problems that you see here, as well as other elements of the scenario. And in fact, the sort of top level finding from this research is about how when companies say they're doing things voluntarily to clean up these problems, it reduces people's interest in having state intervention. It kind of crowds out the state. But I just want to draw attention to some other patterns that I think are kind of interesting when we looked at the way people respond to different types of problems. What we found is that there are a subset of both human rights and environmental problems that boosted people's interest in state intervention, measured in two different ways here. Not surprisingly, things like child labor and modern slavery boosted people's interest in having the state intervene, but also emission of toxic chemicals and pollution of rivers and oceans generated far more interest in state intervention than a problem like overuse or even illegal use of natural resources. Some of you have seen these findings before, I think. We redid the study in a similar way in Germany a few years later and actually found some very similar things. And here we also varied the country in which the damage was occurring. Again, we found that child labor and modern slavery, but also emission of toxic chemicals and to a lesser extent, pollution of rivers and oceans boosted interest in having the German government intervene to address a problem elsewhere in the global supply chain. Now, in neither of these studies did we mention climate change, because actually we started in the US with this design, and we decided we didn't want to talk about climate change because that would overpower everything else, and because attitudes about climate change are so polarized in the US, we simply wanted to avoid that. But I don't want to avoid it anymore. And so what I've been trying to do in some other research is to look practically at policy efforts to tackle global supply chains and scope 3 emissions within the environmental and climate regulatory sphere in the EU, which has of course been a leader in pricing and otherwise trying to regulate carbon emissions. So what I'm going to tell you is about sort of two recent attempts in the European Union to address scope 3 emissions or emissions in global supply chains. One was an attempt, or was a call for companies to develop a requirement that companies would develop their own climate transition plans that would include scope 1, scope 2, and scope 3 emissions, and exercise so-called due diligence over these and other issues in their global supply chains. The policy required companies to make plans and said they should be put into practice over time, but there were really few penalties for failing to do so. The second model required companies to pay for the emissions generated in their supply chains, as well as the emissions generated within the EU. And here, heavy emitters that have been basically exempted, largely exempted from the EU's existing carbon market would now have to pay. So one of these models failed. That is, it doesn't exist as a law, as a policy in the EU. It actually did briefly, but it was very quickly repealed before it could actually take effect. The other model currently exists and in fact just took effect officially this year, 2026. So let me just do a really quick rough poll. Which one do you think failed based on these descriptions at least? Number one, number two. It's actually number one that failed and number two that has survived. And I maybe presented these a little bit to kind of lead you in that direction, but I think it is sort of surprising. It's different from what I expected when I started the research as well. So I'm going to spend the rest of the time kind of talking about what happened in these two policy domains and also what's happened just in the past few months that maybe shifts the story somewhat. So the first model I'll call climate due diligence, or at least it's a version of climate due diligence. And this was the requirement for large companies to adopt so-called climate transition plans that was part of, one small part of a larger policy called the Corporate Sustainability Due Diligence Directive, which also requires companies to exercise due diligence over human rights and other kinds of environmental abuses in their global supply chain. The CSDDD, the Corporate Sustainability Due Diligence Directive, was passed in 2024 and then rolled back in 2025 and actually just officially approved. The rollback was just officially approved last month, eliminating the climate transition plans. The second model I'll call price and protect. And this is the EU's so-called carbon border adjustment mechanism, which is a revision to its existing ETS, emissions trading system. And essentially what the CBAM, or the Carbon Border Adjustment Mechanism, does is require importers of certain kinds of carbon-intensive products in the EU to pay for the emissions, the carbon emissions that occur elsewhere in order for that product to be sold in the EU. And at the same time, it also requires carbon-intensive companies within the EU that had been largely exempted or given free allocations of carbon permits in the ETS. It phases those free allocations out and requires those permits to actually be paid. All right. The story of the CSDDD and climate transition plans and the failure of this model. The Corporate Sustainability Due Diligence Directive in the EU doesn't really start with climate change. It emerged out of mostly concerns about business and human rights. Events like the Rana Plaza factory collapse in 2013 in Bangladesh and many other abuses of activists around mining and oil exploitation sites led to increased concerns and increased calls for mandatory corporate accountability in the EU. Although climate wasn't right there at the beginning, it was pretty quickly incorporated, in part to kind of build support for the policy within the European Commission, and ultimately to make the CSDDD, this Corporate Sustainability Due Diligence Directive, part of the EU's larger Green Deal package of policies. Now, the policy doesn't require firms to actually reduce their emissions, it just requires them to adopt and develop a transition plan. And first it said the company had to implement it, then that got watered down to put into effect, and ultimately that was watered down to just adopt the plan, whether or not it was being implemented. But these were plans that required companies to show how they were going to shift their operations to basically comply with the Paris Agreement, which of course is a set of obligations for governments, but these would be kind of translated through these climate transition plans into obligations for companies. And this would include scope 3 emissions and also ask companies to kind of discuss the progress they were making each year toward those targets. Some companies were fairly comfortable with the CSDDD, with this mandatory due diligence model, and even with this climate transition plan. As you can see in the graph here, this is a little bit of coding we did of companies' responses to the EU on drafts of this policy. And there's certainly some opposition, but there's also quite a few companies up at the upper end of that distribution where they either conditionally or fully supported the policy. In some cases, this was because companies already were beginning to do these things. And on the issue of climate transition plans in particular, some companies, including some banks, were already developing something similar to what the EU policy was calling for. As one representative of a Dutch bank that we spoke to said, all Dutch banks have a quite elaborate climate plan and climate strategy already, which they had in place long before the CSDDD. Otherwise, we would have been killed by Extinction Rebellion years ago. Other companies, of course, did not see it this way. And especially were concerned that adopting these climate transition plans would put them at even greater risk of being sued by environmental and human rights activists. And this was not a theoretical concern because there was and has been a wave of both climate and human rights related lawsuits against oil companies in Europe. One being a suit against the French energy company Total, and also a suit against the French bank BNP Paribas for not fully implementing its decarbonization plans. These were lawsuits that happened under existing laws in both the Netherlands and France, arguing that these companies had basically failed to fulfill their duty of care under those existing laws. And this is one of the things that led to a pretty dramatic counter-mobilization against the CSDDD and against this idea of climate transition plans. In spite of tumultuous policy history in which elements were shifted and revised and the climate transition plan was kind of delinked from the civil liability provision. That is, there were attempts made to make sure that companies would not face additional litigation for having these plans. And the directive passed in the spring of 2024 at the very last second that it could pass before the next European Parliament came in. But other things were happening right around the same time. A backlash to the EU's Green Deal policy was building, including farmer protests in Brussels, as you see on the left, followed by the so-called Draghi report, the influential report from former European central banker Mario Draghi, arguing that regulation was dragging down Europe, and that to be competitive in the global sphere at this point, the EU needed to pursue a deregulatory agenda. And the combination of these two things and other parts of the backlash led in 2025 to a so-called omnibus regulation that rolled back many of the Green Deal policies, including the Corporate Sustainability Due Diligence Directive. And this is where the climate transition plan was completely deleted from the file. And so what's left now is there is a Corporate Sustainability Due Diligence Directive. It requires the largest companies operating in Europe, regardless of where they're headquartered actually. So the largest companies operating in Europe to exercise due diligence over human rights abuses and some environmental abuses, things like toxins and biodiversity, not necessarily climate, in their global supply chains, subjects them to some oversight from national supervisory bodies, no longer holds the possibility of civil liability. That was also stripped out, but says almost nothing, or at least nothing meaningful about climate. So while this policy does exist, the climate elements of it are basically gone. All right, so one puzzle that we're trying to figure out is what exactly happened here and why did this policy fail? Particularly, I think only a couple of you voted for this as the one that you suspected would fail, given that it wasn't particularly a strong set of obligations at the beginning. And so I want to point to three things that happened in this story. One, especially late in the game, as this larger backlash to the Green Deal emerged, fossil fuel companies in various parts of the world really mobilized against it. Exxon took the lead in the US and teamed up with the Trump administration to make quite direct threats against the EU that if this law passed, it would cause further trade tensions. And actually the Trump administration managed to kind of incorporate that into its trade, we'll call them negotiations, with the EU. Within Europe, Total, among other companies, joined with another group of a larger group of CEOs, or kind of led a larger group of CEOs to urge the EU to abolish this policy entirely, not just the climate transition part, but the entire CSDDD, and eventually got the ear of both the French and the German governments, at least in part, although they did retain some of the policy. Second piece of the puzzle here is that there was a larger backlash against this policy and against this idea of mandatory due diligence. It wasn't really about climate. It was about civil liability and the number of companies that would be included in this policy. And the climate transition policies were sort of an easy target that could be pulled out and deleted. And in many ways, the climate transition idea didn't have as much traction and as much support within the business community as some other elements of this policy did. So when it came to exercising due diligence over human rights and environmental abuses in their supply chains, companies like IKEA, Nestle, many others had already been doing this voluntarily and actually felt like this policy was not asking them to do anything more than they could, and they ended up being supportive of it. But there were fewer companies, with the exception of the Dutch banks that I mentioned earlier, that had that position when it came to climate transition plans. So climate transition plans, I think, were sort of a fatality, kind of caught in the crossfire of this larger debate. Third, the idea of translating governmental obligations in the Paris Agreement into corporate obligations is in itself pretty challenging. And this was probably an uphill task to begin with. So even though it doesn't sound particularly threatening to just ask companies to adopt these plans, it did represent this kind of shift in a logic of climate obligation from a state to state kind of obligation to a corporate obligation. We think that had something to do with its demise. On the other hand, just as a side note, when you look at other elements of the other environmental elements of this policy, they ask companies to basically take on obligations of the Montreal Protocol, of the Minamata Convention on Mercury, all sorts of other international environmental treaties that also have been state-to-state treaties are now being translated into corporate obligations. So there it didn't seem to generate quite as much ire. In any case, the climate due diligence model is, I think, dead, maybe not forever. There are some other attempts in California, for instance, to require companies to at least report on scope 3 emissions, as they will have to do in the EU as well. But anything more than reporting seems to be kind of a dead cause at this point. All right. The policy that many of you voted or guessed was the one that didn't make it is the Carbon Border Adjustment Mechanism, or CBAM. The CBAM requires importers of cement, iron and steel, aluminum, fertilizer, electricity, and hydrogen into the EU to pay a carbon fee, a carbon price, for the emissions elsewhere outside the EU that would be equivalent to what they'd be paying if the products were made within the EU, where there is a functioning carbon market. At the same time, it phases out the free allowances that steel and aluminum and cement producers and others within Europe have been getting that for the last 10 years have essentially prevented them from having to pay for their carbon emissions, including steel plants that are burning coal, incredibly carbon-intensive cement production factories, and so on. So the idea is those carbon-intensive producers in Europe will now have to pay for their emissions. The sort of environmental community like this, but they will get some protection from imports, and the industries tended to like this. So this was sort of the bargain that's embedded in CBAM. It originates actually in part with companies themselves. So the steel company ArcelorMittal didn't single-handedly create this, but did call quite early for something like this because, of course, they were facing international competition, and they worried that they were being undercut by much dirtier, more carbon-intensive steel production in China, India, and other parts of the world. The French government also picked up on this idea and became a big backer. And this, in Ursula von der Leyen's Green Deal initiative, Green Deal package, the CBAM became pretty quickly a central cornerstone of this larger agenda. And as you see in the plot on the right, businesses that responded to the EU's call for feedback were fairly supportive of this policy. There wasn't a ton of strong opposition within the EU, at least. And that's because many of the companies that stood to gain the most would receive what they hoped would be some protection from imports. Now, those of you who have talked about the CBAM know that outside of Europe, this is an incredibly controversial policy that many governments and exporters have accused of being protectionist and even sort of imperialist in its orientations. One of the things that I did with the help of some Georgetown students last summer was to try to gather some information about how different governments around the world were responding to the CBAM. Because if there's a functioning carbon price in another country, then the EU would essentially accept that as equivalent to the carbon price within the EU. And those importers would not have to pay extra for their carbon emissions. So one of the things that the CBAM could do is actually lead to a massive expansion of carbon pricing around the world. And indeed, that's begun to happen in some places. We found quite a few countries where there were at least the beginnings of carbon price expansion or development, carbon taxes that might ultimately satisfy the EU's criteria. But many other countries, and some of the ones that were also adapting, were simultaneously contesting and resisting the EU's kind of protectionism, either threatening or actually taking cases to the WTO. Interestingly, other countries were beginning to kind of mimic this approach, and we might also see a globalization of carbon border adjustment mechanisms as well, or at least globalization or diffusion of this price and protect kind of model. All right. Within the EU, in some ways, it wasn't too hard to get the big commodity producers that make steel, aluminum to a lesser extent, steel, cement, fertilizer on board with this policy. Initially, what they wanted was to keep their free allowances and get protection from imports. That is, to keep not having to pay for their own emissions within Europe and have their competitors face import charges for their emissions. But the European Commission did not go for that, and it very quickly became clear that there would be this phase out of free allowances at the same time that there was a phase in of these CBAM charges. And as the person described in the, as the person in the first quote above described it, gradually companies kind of came around to this idea that, well, I suppose we'll accept a phase out of free allowances, but we need to have a very gradual, very slow kind of phase out of those and phase in of CBAM charges. But there was some risk and some uncertainty. So as you can imagine, if you're a carbon intensive producer in Europe, and you've been getting free allowances that keep you from having to pay for most of your emissions for the past 15 years, and someone says, well, now we're going to do this differently, and you're going to have to pay, but don't worry, you'll get some protection from imports, it might make you a little nervous. And indeed, some companies were nervous. As the aluminum industry representative quoted here said, you have the system that's been tested, the free allowance system, to be replaced with something that's not been tested. And it's naive to believe that companies elsewhere will not go for the opportunity of circumventing the system that will bring them more profit and more market. That is, they're worried that they're going to get stuck paying for their emissions within Europe, and their international competitors will find ways of kind of gaming the system. And for this and other reasons, aluminum companies were actually much less supportive of this policy than many other potentially covered companies. They got some concessions to bring them along. Chemical manufacturers were also quite worried that this would mess up their global supply chains, but they were ultimately able to basically opt out and not be included as a so-called CBAM sector. Now, the big opponents here within Europe should have been appliance manufacturers, car manufacturers, farmers and agribusiness firms that rely on imported steel, aluminum, fertilizer, and so on. And as another interviewee put it, CBAM is a massive fight between EU primary production and EU downstream. That is the downstream manufacturers that make appliances, cars, and so on. If you're primary production, you should want a CBAM. But then if you're more downstream, you're like, well, I just want cheap products, so I don't want a CBAM. I don't want to have to pay a carbon price. And indeed, there were some attempts by auto parts manufacturers, appliance manufacturers, manufacturers of wind turbines to push to make sure that this policy didn't raise their costs so much that they would become uncompetitive. Especially among those that worried that in addition to selling in Europe, where they might be protected, they were also going to be selling in other markets where there was no carbon price. So if you're a European manufacturer and you're selling in the US and you're paying for your carbon emissions, even if those are generated elsewhere, but you're competing against a Chinese manufacturer that's not paying for its carbon emissions, either in the US or in China, then the European manufacturers worried they would be disadvantaged. Ultimately, the companies that had the most to lose within Europe from this policy were concerned, but they weren't as organized, as powerful, and we think ultimately as in tune and experienced with the emissions trading system as were the steel and cement manufacturers that really pushed this through. Now, there are continued concerns even after passage about this export problem, and many requests by appliance and auto parts manufacturers, for instance, to get so-called export rebates, where the carbon costs that they're paying would be given back to them for the parts of their production that are going outside the EU. This is a big problem for WTO compatibility, and the EU has basically refused to do that because they maybe are the last government on the planet that still cares about the WTO. But they've tried to find other ways to kind of cushion the harm for those exports. Even as the backlash to the Green Deal mounted from, say, 2023 up to the present, the carbon border adjustment mechanism has basically survived. This omnibus regulation that I mentioned that dramatically rolled back the Corporate Sustainability Due Diligence Directive did relatively small things to the CBAM. It reduced the number of small companies that would have to pay this charge, but it preserved, I think, quite a lot of impact of this system. And in fact, one of the ways of responding to concerns about the weaknesses of CBAM has been to argue that it shouldn't just be this initial set of commodities. It should expand to include finished products, not just raw commodities. So why did this price and protect model succeed? Now, the first reason is maybe the most obvious. Many of the obligations and the costs ultimately fall on exporters outside the EU. There is certainly a nationalist, or in this case, a kind of regionalist logic to this style of climate regulation. And of course, this is why many governments outside the EU are quite critical. And many of its benefits are going to rest with large, powerful primary industries within the EU. In addition, as I mentioned, I don't know if the reference here is too old or not. The solution to the problem of CBAM has been more CBAM. Mostly the call has been to, well, if the problem is that you're going to have manufacturers of like secondary goods, not primary products, but like somewhat manufactured goods be disadvantaged by this, well, let's just expand the policy so that those items would also be subject to these import carbon fees. And maybe let's go all the way to finished products, such that a washing machine produced in China and sold in Europe would be subject to the same kinds of carbon charges that a washing machine produced entirely within the EU would be subject to. It hasn't gone that far yet, but it's not hard to imagine. On the other hand, it's become clear that the risks to import-dependent producers within the EU have not gone away. And this is the reason that just recently, farmers and agribusiness companies have been pushing for the fertilizer industry to be completely exempted from this policy, in fear that it would raise fertilizer prices for European farmers. Just recently, the EU announced that it would not exempt fertilizer. So for now, at least, the full set of sectors, the full set of industries are still covered within this policy. The second reason I think this made it through, both that it passed and that it survived this backlash to the Green Deal, is that the CBAM took this sector-specific approach that sort of reduced the opposition from industry. So an industry like chemical manufacturing could basically opt out of this policy rather than being stuck with it. And if not for that, I think we would have seen actually much bigger fights about the CBAM than we actually saw. Third, this idea of climate due diligence represents a kind of new sort of obligation for companies. But the CBAM is really sort of an addition or revision or an addendum to the existing system of carbon pricing within Europe. It's not something entirely new. It's kind of a gradual shift in the ETS. And by most accounts, the ETS is well established within Europe. So maybe this has something to do with why you didn't get as strong of a backlash to the CBAM as you did to this other policy. I have to say, though, events of the last year and especially of the last couple of months raised some real questions about whether carbon pricing and the ETS within Europe are actually as well established and taken for granted and robust as we might have thought. My alarm bells went off when I read a piece that you see on the left here about ArcelorMittal, this company that in some ways created CBAM, giving up the subsidies, quite generous subsidies that it was going to get to decarbonize its steel production in Germany because it simply wasn't profitable to do it. The energy costs were going to be too high. So this seems to be a bit of a reversal here, right? Business Europe, among others, is the largest kind of business lobby within EU, has revived the call for free allowances to be continued. That is to basically not phase out or to much more slowly, much more gradually phase out the free allowances that carbon intensive producers in Europe have been getting. This hasn't happened yet, but it could. And just a couple of weeks ago, actually just before the attack in Iran, the bombing in Iran happened, Italy called on the EU to suspend the ETS entirely. And it's garnered some support from other actors, other governments on this as well. And as you can imagine, as energy markets have been disrupted and energy prices have gone up even more over the past 2 weeks, you could imagine this call for the ETS to be suspended, for carbon pricing in Europe to sort of be put on hold for a while. You can imagine that those calls might grow loud. All right. Last thing, and then I want to open it up to discussion and see what questions this raises for you. When I wrote the abstract for this talk, I think I sent this to Priscilla just, it wasn't that long ago. It seems like forever ago. I kind of wrote about these two models being divergent, right? One policy model succeeded and the other failed. And in recent times, recent weeks, I've come to think that actually there's some convergence amidst this divergence. That is, as much as the CBAM and the idea of carbon pricing within the EU seem to, in some ways, survive the backlash to the Green Deal, it hasn't survived just yet, and there are some elements of it that are being chipped away at. So, to some degree, the fate of these two models, while I do think is different, there's been some convergence in the midst of this backlash. Climate due diligence, I think, is gone, at least for now. But this price and protect model is alive and maybe well, or at least surviving. However, the protect part seems to have come out more and more amidst geopolitical tensions and concerns about competitiveness in Europe. And I think there's possibility that CBAM, which has always been a bargain between protection for European producers and real decarbonization policy, getting rid of free allowances and pricing carbon, that the protection side will persist and the decarbonization side will go away. I don't have sophisticated ideas about how to prevent that happening, but it does seem clear to me from following this policy history that for the decarbonization piece of this policy to remain credible or to regain credibility, it would take, on one hand, large and meaningful support for decarbonization in lower income countries. In the aluminum industry in Mozambique, one of the poorest countries in the world, that's also one of the most exposed to CBAM charges. In the steel industry of India, which is incredibly carbon intensive. If one could combine this kind of price and protect model in an affluent jurisdiction with massive and meaningful support for decarbonization elsewhere, then I think this model could have some promise. And of course, the integrity of this price and protect model depends on whether carbon pricing itself has any integrity. And as there are greater temptations to turn to carbon offsets and carbon credits, which the EU has recently started to toy with a bit more after having resisted over the past decade, I fear the integrity of carbon pricing could also come into question in the midst of this backlash. However, I think if the EU can hold on to the integrity of carbon pricing, at the very least, there might be some potential for this model to promote real decarbonization once we, fingers crossed, get out of this multiple set of crises that we're in currently. Thanks so much. Look forward to the discussion.
Oh, thanks so much for a super interesting talk. I wanted to ask your opinion about the EU omnibus, one that took down the climate due diligence. The official explanation has been right that it's the reason for simplifying the reporting requirements was to promote competitiveness of European companies, but it did sort of happen at the same time as the backlash against sustainability was taking place everywhere. And EU was sort of seen for a while as the stronghold, right? Through the Green Deal and the leader in this space. And then I've also heard my informants in Norway talk about that really Green Deal, all the reporting was just basically a boon for consultants to do all the paperwork, but in fact, it didn't really count to anything. So taking some of the stuff away, simplifying that away did not, in their opinion, really make a big difference. Maybe just simplified things really in earnest. So I wanted to ask you, do you agree with those explanations? Do you have anything else to add?
Yeah,
based on
I
your
mean,
research?
thanks. So I would say, in my view, the competitiveness language and the backlash to the Green Deal are very much intertwined. I mean, the competitiveness language is coming from kind of the center and the center right, and the strongest backlash is coming from the further right. But I think they both happen at the same moment. They both see deregulation as the solution to Europe's problem, and they both led to the omnibus really scaling back the CSDDD and other policies, as you mentioned. The corporate sustainability reporting directive, I think, is what you're pointing to as well. Whether that rollback really is damaging, I think is your second question, right? So, I mean, I agree on some level that what the CSRD, the reporting directive, and the CSDDD, the due diligence directive, what they ask companies to do is kind of what I called in my book that Rebecca mentioned, process over performance. There's a lot of like creating processes and plans that are not really strongly linked to actually preventing human rights and environmental abuses, or actually dealing with the aftermath of human rights or environmental abuses. So on that level, I mean, I guess I agree with your Norwegian informant in some ways, in that I'm not incredibly sorry to see some of that go away. However, I think the big thing that happened with the CSDDD, two big things actually. One is the number of companies that would be covered under this policy shrank dramatically. So they raised the size threshold. So now it's really just the very largest companies in Europe that are even bound to these duties at all. And the second is that they eliminated the possibility of civil liability. That is, they eliminated a sort of framework for human rights advocates, environmental advocates, or victims of human rights abuses to actually file suit against companies in European courts. And I think that's a real shame, because I think that's one of the few channels for meaningful redress. And even though those lawsuits often don't go anywhere and they take forever, and they're, a lot of resources and frustration, I do think that's a meaningful pressure point against what has been a kind of world of voluntary standards for corporate responsibility amidst a lot of impunity and lack of real consequences.
Thank you, Tim. That was fascinating. And I'm wrapping my mind around a lot of this, but one of the problems that I've been chewing on is the reality that like a lot of developed states will have strong environmental policies for within their own country, right? But at the expense of consumption of products from places that don't have strong environmental policies. So you're essentially exporting your environmental degradation. And I'm wondering if there is some reason to discuss more, even though it might seem protectionist, like you were saying, the national policies in the United States that maybe also kind of lift up these organizations that are doing good environmental work in our own borders. And I realize this is a bit of a baby question, and I don't really understand this field super well, but it seems like a kind of an interesting, unexpected convergence between what I would consider to be rather the conservative rhetoric in the United States, like thinking nationally, bringing industries back into the United States, and actually how we could use environmental policy to sort of meet those two rather disparate things in the middle.
So thanks. I mean, the way you described it is exactly what these policies are intended to address, which is that even as environmental regulation, in some ways, environmental performance has improved in the US and EU over time. Well, that's in part because we've externalized our dirtiest activities to other countries, and we're benefiting, we're profiting as companies and as consumers and as citizens from that pushing of those hazards to other places. And the reason that the focus of this project is on the EU is that the EU is taking the lead in trying to address that, right? Through these policies and a couple of others as well. where does the US fit, I think is in one way your question. I mean, there have been calls for CBAM in the US, but this is weird, right? Because we don't price carbon, at least at a national level anyhow. And so the argument by some has been there were actually competing proposals a couple of years ago. Some argued that we should have a national carbon price and have this kind of protection. So that basically mimic the kind of European model. And others, the Republican version was, well, let's just have the protection without the carbon pricing. And we'll argue that American manufacturers are already cleaner than their counterparts. And actually, as much as I think that's incredibly hypocritical and problematic, in some industries, it's not entirely wrong. Like European steel companies are literally burning coal. US steel manufacturers mostly aren't doing that. And actually, it switched for reasons that had little to do with climate, but there's less carbon intensive steel in the US. It's still really carbon intensive because our electricity is really carbon intensive. But so that's all to say, sorry, I'm going a little ahead of myself. A couple years ago, I would have said, I don't know what's going to happen. Let's walk down the street and try to find out if this idea of a CBAM has any legs in the US, and if it can actually include some measures that do decarbonize carbon intensive industries in the US. Now it seems like the current administration just wants to put up whatever protection it wants against whoever it wants because it's a bully, right? And the idea of having to justify that on the basis of carbon emissions or pollution seems to have just gone away. I think the idea of justifying any kind of power move on the basis of anything other than we have the power to do it, so why wouldn't we, seems to have gone by the wayside. Now, if we come to our senses somehow in the coming years, I do think this kind of fusion of protectionism and carbon pricing can be politically quite palatable, right? Can bring together coalitions that wouldn't otherwise exist. The Biden administration tried to do that with green industrial policy, which is not pricing. It's like, it's sort of like subsidize the green industries, and indirectly you're going to provide them protection from imports because you're going to kind of prop them up. And that model, which I actually think I prefer over the pricing, the carbon pricing model, it didn't have a lot of legs. That is, it's in the midst of being gutted by the Trump administration and barely had time to get going.
Thank you.
Yeah, thank you so much, Tim. This is a really fascinating talk, so I really appreciate it. My question is about the why you had a slide about why the CSDDD failed, and you mentioned 3 reasons. And I was wondering if those 3 reasons for its failure were sort of equally weighted in your opinion, or if maybe that first one, like the fossil fuel company mobilization, might be more of a reason or less of a reason, especially given what we know about their, work with PR firms and other tactics.
That's a good question. I mean, it's a little complicated to figure out because the climate transitions were just one part of a broader array of things in the CSDDD, and they're also just one of the things that got rolled back. I think that with or without the mobilization of the fossil fuel companies, there would have been a rollback of the CSDDD. Maybe not the climate transition part. So actually there's another paper or a paper we have on the CSDDD more generally. And it turns out that, some of the governments that ended up really being hostile toward the CSDDD, well, I don't want to get too far into this, but there was a lot of concern about the civil liability provision. And even governments that already had their own national due diligence policies, like France and Germany, ended up not being particularly supportive of the EU policy. And that didn't really have to do with the climate piece, right? So I think there was a kind of, And the reason that it worked was that the political tide shifted and the European Parliament shifted and the coalitions within those countries shifted, not yet in France, soon. And so there was a kind of opportunity to roll back some elements of the CSSSD. When it comes to the climate piece, yeah, I think if it weren't for Exxon and especially Total really going on the offensive against this, then I think it would have been relatively easy to see this as like a small piece, something some companies were already doing, other companies probably needed to start doing, and no one was really going to get fined for not having a good enough climate transition plan. And so for the climate piece, I do think the fossil fuel companies were really, really important. Interestingly, fossil fuel companies don't seem to mind the CBAM so much because number one, they're not covered under it. And number two, to the extent that they could be covered in the future, it really only affects their like production and refining related emissions, not the emissions from the burning of the oil that they're producing, right? So it's kind of upstream supply chain is really what's covered in CBAM. But when it comes to climate transition plans, they certainly saw a threat.
I'm just wondering if you have any thoughts on revenues from CBAM, because I think especially with the proposed expansion to these downstream products, a lot of countries are supporting that to repay EU COVID debt. And to me, it seems logical to reinvest CBAM revenues. I know they're not massive, but whatever revenues may arise when payments start happening into Mozambique or India to support those industries. So what do you think are the options for maybe recycling some of the CBAM revenues?
Yeah, it's a great question. I agree wholeheartedly. And I should say one of the other reasons I probably should have mentioned why CBAM is attractive is that it's revenue generating for governments and actually generates revenue that goes into like general purpose funds that can be used for a variety of things. I would join with you and others who have said those funds should be used in part to support decarbonization outside the EU, particularly in places where there are a few other resources for that or where the other resources for that come with a lot of strings attached. In practice, I think what's happening is that those funds, some of those funds are going to get used to subsidize the exporters in a way that's seemingly WTO compliant. So what the EU is now going to do is instead of, it can't just like give a rebate to an exporter directly or it would be in violation of the EU, but it can give support to industries that do a lot of exporting. And my understanding is, I don't know the percentage, they're going to take some of the EU or some of the CBAM revenue and use it to basically pacify the export-oriented companies in Europe who are, you know, amidst this competitiveness kind of crisis. I would love to see a kind of justice dimension of this get some of the funding. My understanding, I'm not totally up to speed on this. You may know more than I do. My understanding is that the EU has been very resistant to that. There's like some side funding that's supposed to help with decarbonization in low income countries, but they've been resistant to really expanding that. I would love for there to be a way for that to change. I don't personally know what it is, but yeah, let's talk.